Hello everyone, today we come back on the Franks and discuss their settlement in Gaul and the figure of Clovis. So recently I made some video about Gallic history between the 5th, 6th century, and I decided to come back on this because I think it's a very important chapter of first of all of the migration era proper, but really also of the whole medieval history. I think I will never be able to stress enough the importance of this period for the later developments, considering not just the Merovingian Empire but also the Carolingian one as a successor, let's say, and everything that this entailed for European history. Because this is, I think, Gaul is one of the most fascinating environments of hybridation between the Germanic and Roman, and in this case Gallic or Celtic society, as you want to call it. This actually every regional perspective is fascinating. I mean, British perspective is beautiful under this point of view. Iberian perspective is beautiful. The Italian perspective is beautiful. There are, I mean, I like the Middle Ages especially because they were so diverse in its part, and let's be honest, it's much more difficult to learn about the Middle Ages than other periods in history that maybe look more grandiose under the point of, I don't know, think about the Roman Empire. All the prejudice attached to the fact that at this point of the migration era it was in the East, that wasn't really the Roman Empire but the Byzantine, like, yeah, it's less. This is just actually a silly prejudice, but objectively, sometimes I think people don't get interested into the Middle Ages because they think, oh wow, there were so many big empires in the previous times, in the ancient era, and then afterwards in the modern age it starts once again. Well, the Middle Ages, it was, I don't know, I remember there was a girl who was also a historian to me, and she told me, I don't know, I think, when I told her that it was a medievalist, she told me, oh, well, I think the Middle Ages are the weakest period in history. What does that, you know, I didn't ask her for other, because I wasn't, let's say I was more interested in her, in other qualities of hers. No, I really don't want to sound like a jerk. Actually, I didn't tell her anything because she was nice otherwise. And I didn't want to create other, you know, to create any attrition. But let's say that friendship was not entirely successful. Also, thanks to the fact she was a contemporary historian, by the way. So I got this little bit. Well, these are jokes, obviously, but it is true. However, that was a brilliant example. She was a historian as well. She had this kind of misconception about the Middle Ages, and what I find interesting, I'm pretty neutral to the Middle Ages as well. You know, as a medievalist, sometimes I take things like, oh wow, the Middle Ages were the most beautiful period, but I realize, as a historian, I don't have this huge favoritism. I like to tell the story for what it is, and my most subjective approach to the Middle Ages is stating, as I often do in my videos, that the Middle Ages never existed in the first place, just like nor contemporary or modern or ancient histories ever occurred. We're talking about societies that were transforming, were evolving, and that is also very difficult to find, you know, a common reading through the Middle Ages, because yes, certain things were pretty transversal. Sometimes in the Eurasian continent, in the Mediterranean, but as you see, like in this case, every single regional player here had its own characteristics that are all the more interesting, also because societies were pretty homogeneous in many ways. So the differences that existed are something that are more grounded on a political and cultural base rather, and social ways as well. I don't have to get too far from structuralism in this sense, but in this sense are even easier to spot once you get them. You know, you understand what it's about, and Gaul is so this we're gonna stick to this now, and and what happened in Gaul is definitely something that had to be extremely influential for the rest of Western, say, history, and not only that, naturally. So what's the deal with Gaul? I mean, why these changes occurred? You know, what factor did the Franks play into it? With how much was important in terms of the Roman background, or even the Celtic background in part? So let's say that Gaul has one big structural advantage. I've been discussing this in those videos I made, so I'm not gonna repeat that very much, but I mean, it's pretty self-evident. Gaul is a very big entity. So if you take, you know, here we're discussing essentially the history of the Frankish kingdom, and the Frankish kingdom rather stretched into northern France. Southern France was a bit different, because the Great Plain that stretches from, say, the Pyrenees to up to even to Germany, to Poland, actually there is not even a limit in this sense, is this very fertile area with lots of rivers, a lot of plains, a lot of agricultural resources. Aquitaine was a bit far out of reach from the Franks, even if they managed to conquer it, to kick the Visigoths out of there, but remained always a sort of periphery of the kingdom. Provence and the Rhone basin remained enclosed a little bit by the Massif Central, the Jura Mountains, so kind of stuck also a little bit on its own, and that's where in fact the Burgundians had developed their own kingdom as a separate thing. But in the Great Plains of northern France, so this is with a very fertile, very fat soil, a lot of resources. Those would have been crucial even for developing later into the lower Middle Ages the French culture. Think about the great Gothic cathedrals, all the resources that existed around the Ile-de-France, that in fact, since this very moment was a very important area. Let's say there is a continuity also with Paris in these times, although the Merovingians and the Carolingians didn't have capitals proper. Paris was already kind of important in this late antique time, but it was just one of the major centers there in northern France, one of the many. Clovis actually stemmed from Tournai, so this also has to be considered. For instance, London was much more ancient and more properly capital than Paris, in actual fact, also during feudal times. So this was because indeed Francia proper was a very big thing. It didn't just encompass Gaul, but also parts of Germany. It stretched basically from the Loire River to the Scheldt River. So a very big, fertile area, a lot of plains, a lot of agricultural resources. Gaul had been, since ancient times, an extremely wealthy place, unlike Germany. And it had all the conditions to favor a sedentary civilization. That's why basically the Romans conquered Gaul and stuck to there, while with Germany they tried that, but eventually they backed off because they realized that the costs were superior to the benefits, and this was mostly due to the fact that Germany was a terrible place environmentally speaking. Just however, like some other areas of the empire that formerly were encompassed by the Roman domination, but that remained kind of out of Romanization. And even in Gaul you can see this. For instance, Bretagne, what Romans called like Armorica, was sort of a desert. There were very wild populations, never got fully Romanized, despite Gaul remained under Rome for in this sense a half of a millennium. So it's very interesting to see even how the local cultures reacted differently with the Roman one. So Gaul, at this time in the 5th century, when the Franks kind of kick in, had a big deal of structural riches, because first of all it had not got devastated, unlike other areas of the empire. By the 5th century, Italy was also intact, more or less. Yes, of course, it was a general crisis, a transformation, a shrinking of many, the Roman power in general, which, by the way, had to do, corresponded also to a general crisis of the so-called barbarians. So it's not that the barbarians were so well off because they stole the lands from the Romans. They were often, in fact, settled in pretty poor lands. Even the Franks at this point were settled by the Romans along the Rhine, as federati, because they, those were areas that, although once very developed, now were pretty much deserted, and so it wasn't like a big, beautiful time to be in. And actually, the Romans up to this point, up to 406 AD, had managed to actually keep out the barbarians from the richest areas of the empire, including in Gaul. In fact, these more Romanized lands. As a matter of fact, the most Romanized lands of Gaul was the south. So Provence, there was a very ancient Romanization. Aquitaine also partly, although I would have to discuss about that, because not all what was called Aquitaine after the Diocletian reforms was like that. It was mostly the Narbonensis that had been Romanized, while the the Atlantics, from the Atlantic watershed and the plain of the Guyenne, where there is the Bordeaux, that wasn't that so much Romanized, as a matter of fact, but it still owned a sort of, calling it proto-national identity is a bit too much, but let's say that it was called Aquitaine, as a matter of fact, because there were the Aquitanians in there. So these populations, together with the Vasci, etc., didn't even come from Gaul. They weren't Celtic. They were Celticized in part, but they were mostly another thing. So even in ancient times, even Gaul was not entirely Celtic. Or there were other ethnicities like the Ligurians, like etc. But let's say that Gaul, the whole Gaul, actually was pretty much Romanized for the Roman Empire's standards, as much as Italy in certain parts, like especially the south of France was pretty analogous. I mean, the south of France was much more Romanized than the north of Italy, as a matter of fact, as the Po Valley was something that had always remained a bit detached from the great Mediterranean traffics, and it was actually to rise economically just into the Middle Ages. Well, also at this time, obviously, was important. Cities like Milan, like Pavia, like Verona were extremely important, but they were mostly so as military centers. Like a bit in Gaul, they were like Trier, these cities that had more than else a strategical value than a rather, being the capitals of great fertile areas. The most fertile areas of Italy were the south, the center, and Sicily, and so other lands of the empire, including south of Spain, what is today's Tunisia, and Greece and Anatolia, West Anatolia especially, were very, very Romanized, very, very even urbanized, and this is important also for Gaul, because all these big Roman cities and infrastructures and roads and all were something that eventually were exploited also massively during the Middle Ages. But let's say that Gaul had this very thick net of infrastructures. Gaul is, by the way, in this northern part, very easy to control. I mean, historically speaking, it's always been relatively difficult to conquer France. Leave aside, when the Germans come out, basically, in the 1870s. But, France, in these medieval and modern times, has always been this very tough nut to crack. But actually, when you conquer France, it's a very easy place to control, because you have, in fact, since the Roman times, all the major cities on these main roads that are that connect they were actually all Celtic settlements even before the Roman conquest. So the Romans basically built over this pre-existent structure, and therefore and the countryside is extremely fertile. It has wall loads of agricultural resources, and since here we are in pre-industrial times, this was actually made the wealth of the territory. As a matter of fact, by the 5th century, Gaul was richer than Italy in quantitative terms. The Italians were still and would remain essentially still richer per capita than the Frankish Gaul, but as we said many times, society was very, very different, and it was, let's say, more Gallic society was more verticized, and as I was saying before, Italy now was still standing on its feet in spite of its decline. Eventually, in the 6th century, Italy gets destroyed by the Greek Gothic War. So at that point, Italy is razed to the ground, and this changes completely the society. I made lots of videos about Lombard Italy. Actually, I made a playlist on it to explain better how the transformations occurred, and they weren't really so bad transformations, to tell it all. I mean, the Italians were pretty much well off with the Longobards than the average French was under the Franks, because the Franks developed essentially this very, very aristocratic society. For what reason? Well, because they basically mixed with the Roman senatorial aristocracy. So basically in Gaul, while in Italy the Roman latifundium disappeared, and basically the population basically transformed into this Germanic model of the freemen that the Longobards imported, so where everybody more or less had a decent amount of land and was in this sense pretty well off for those time standards. Into Gaul, the great masters, the great domini, the great senators basically intermarried with the Germanic aristocracy, and they created this extremely aristocratic society that was going to be the base of eventually feudalism. So with a guy that is very wealthy and that lots of guys that will work for him in dear conditions. Naturally, also in Gaul, this could be varied, but let's say talking by average, this is how this transformation occurred. So this very big piece of cake of the Roman Empire was always was naturally looked upon with great lust by the barbarians, and those among the barbarians who had managed to get closer to reach this were essentially the Franks. Initially, they were a bit challenged in the process. I don't know how to start this now. Maybe we'll talk about it later. For now, let's just let's just stress the fact of how much Gaul had managed to catalyze, as a matter of fact, even the same process of transformation of the Roman Empire. Basically, Gaul, had been at this time of the late antique really the lighthouse of late antique civilization in the West. So the Roman domination arrived essentially in this Gallo-Roman world that had reached a central position into the Latin West. So not just from a geographical point of view, so we've seen how Gaul was important also in terms of resources and all, but also for the cultural developments, both of its cities and of its aristocratic classes. So we're talking also about bishops, naturally, and monasteries. Gaul was, especially the most Romanized part, was very quickly Christianized. And since there were all these money, all these, say, donations around, actually some of the most developed forms of monasticism had kicked into in there. So the most important monastic communities at the times were in the Lorraine Islands, in Provence, in the Mediterranean, and there was this constant contact between these communities and the bishops, so that the monastery was not even seen as a complete isolation from the world, like it would have happened in Italy after it was razed to the ground with Saint Benedict, with people like going to live into the wilderness of the Apennines. And in Gaul it was a very much and in Italy it was a poor monasticism. In Gaul instead was a monasticism of elite, leaving aside also the prestige of certain saints like Saint Martin of Tours, other figures that definitely had an impact. I mean, France has this very strong religious legacy that dates so as early as the late antique, because all these saints were actually not properly medieval ones. They were the very originary ones of the first centuries of Christianity, that were so important in this sense, also to back ideologically the Frankish monarchy, and afterwards the French one, because this was, France really felt and still feels probably much this idea of continuity, this idea that France is a great idea, the idea of a state, the idea of a state, let's say, because even the idea of the monarchy then, of course, has been challenged by the French Revolution and all, but it's the great state. It's when these debates went on, especially during the Renaissance, when France was at that time a pretty mighty power, and all the other nations at the time were realizing that what the French were doing in administrative terms, in terms of military organization, was something great, and there was a sort of early French, let's say, proto-national identity, even at the time. Obviously, mostly northern France, because today's France is, essentially the product of northern France invading all the guys that were around there. And this started, in fact, from this very moment, from the conquest of Clovis, that annexed Aquitaine, Burgundy, Alemannia. So obviously the Merovingian Empire was larger than today's France, and today's France emerges most of all from eventually the later Carolingian repartitions as something on its own. Obviously there is not even a properly direct continuity between the Merovingians and the later French, the Capetian dynasty through the Carolingians. I mean, it's something much more complex than that. Sometimes you may want to stress the continuity, yes, because there was indeed a structural continuity in this. We're talking about the same places in a moment in history where technology couldn't really make you go much more far than that. So it's obvious that these basins of the Seine River or the other areas of the Loire River were, kind of drawing up a political geography of, let's say, in a political, a territorial policy, telling the truth. So yeah, you can say that the basics were created then, because indeed there is some far continuity between the Merovingian kingdom and the later French state, and this is all the more meaningful because up to that point, there had never been anything like the let's say a kingdom of Gaul. This is true also for other regions of Europe, telling the truth, but it's meaningful because it emerged as a necessity at a certain point for these Germanic rulers to clear a state, where their borders actually. This was easier in countries like Spain or Italy that had kind of a more identifiable, let's say, geographical boundary in some form. France, in this sense, remained a bit fluctuating and pretty also, tending towards the expansion, telling the truth. because today we have France, we have Belgium, we have the Netherlands. Those are later developments that mostly occurred from partly also proto-national reasons, but also feudal ones or other contingent factors that happened for for transformations that occurred on a much more local level. But at the time of the Franks, the trajectories of expansion were much broader. This is also another thing we should remember, that the Middle Ages, as we imagine it, as this moment of especially the early Middle Ages, as of contraction, at this time, especially up to the 6th century, did not really exist. And when you look at these big kingdoms in the Latin Germanic West, you realize, wow, these guys actually had a big domain. If you take Merovingian France, if you take Ostrogothic Italy, those were pretty big domains. They encompass also many other lands. So at this time, the resources to carry out a sort of regional scale policy were still out there. And that's what Clovis uses at the fullest to subjugate all these populations that would have remained eventually tied in a way or another to the at least to the Frankish political ensemble. So how did really the Franks emerge? This is also a very important part to stress, because really the history of Frankish Gaul could have gone in very, very different ways. So the Franks are these a league, a confederation, how you want to call them. I like confederation, but sometimes you realize that it's difficult to even draw a line. I mean, in the case of the Franks, it's a bit easier, but with other populations, you don't know whether to call them tribe or confederations, because these were actually all tribes sticking together. So I prefer the term confederation most of the times. But this was much more particularly evident in the case of the Franks, that had emerged really from those Western Frankish tribes dwelling roughly in today's northwestern Germany, so in territories that were I don't know how to say this, but they're essentially pretty thickly wooded lands, first of all. So these, we're talking about the Western Germans, who were roughly also the ones who made less use of cavalry, for instance, if you're interested in military stuff, which is kind of funny, because eventually the Franks would have developed their very strong cavalry, but this happened only because they settled into Gaul, where they had the structures to do that. So the Franks, you can argue that paradoxically during the migration era were among the Germans that made the least use of cavalry at the time. Probably just the Anglo-Saxons or other northern and the Scandinavian peoples, Germanic peoples, did use cavalry less than the Franks, whereas the other, especially the Eastern Germans, but also I think also the ones who dwelled into the in certain parts of southern Germany, etc., seemingly made more use of that. The Goths, the Longobards, were usually credited with having very strong cavalries, at least before their sedentarization. This is also interesting, because you realize that the Franks didn't have traditionally a strong cavalry, but they settle in Gaul, where they can develop the strongest one, basically at the end of the migration era. Whereas the Ostrogoths or the Longobards, who had a traditionally very strong cavalries, settle into lands like Italy and to Spain that couldn't support the development of such strong cavalry, at least on the the same clientelary basis of the Franks. By the way, certain lands are not even good for horse breeding in some measures. So these are all things that, but it's mostly political and social factors here triggering these modifications. So the Franks emerge. We have a first knowledge of them from the 3rd century AD. We don't really know much about them, how they formed, etc. But we know, in fact, they were a pretty unstable group. So these were actually populations that weren't really strong, as you can understand. I mean, in the east of Germany, if you take the Swabian Confederation, you realize that since a very early age, even before a century before Christ, there was this tendency towards greater the formation of more stratified and greater coalitions of Germanic tribes. The West remained always a bit so-so. Especially the northwestern Germans were, they were actually aggressive. They also launched some raids into the empire, but they were some of the most locally based tribes. In part, these were actually the same part of us. The Franks were made up of the same tribes that defeated the Romans at the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest. So there was also this continuity in. We don't have to think of the Franks as people with a different mentality like that. The Germans were actually pretty wild and pretty primitive up to a very late age, but as I often say in my videos, this was a plus eventually when they settled into the Roman lands, because they were much more open to paradoxically, but this is something that is very difficult to understand, especially in the wake of modern political ideologies, that primitive societies are much more easily transformable than more complex societies, and they have less cultural resistance. But there still was, partly because also the Germanic tribes had began to change a bit their lifestyle during the migration era. If you take these tribes at the times of Augustus, these were really like the primitives, like of the caves. Really, well, not really of the caves. Obviously, they had villages, they had more developed societies, but they were a bit more, they were really poor. They were really wild. Their environment didn't support anything greater than certain conglomerations. They thought, you can see that from their material culture. Some of them hadn't really entered even the Iron Age. The Germans entered the Iron Age roughly at the time of Augustus. They had other materials, but they were also pretty effective, as we have seen, military speaking. So never think that technology is really what makes the difference into warfare, because it doesn't. And the idea is that such populations, however, began to change. First of all, they got pretty much Romanized since a very early age, because throughout the Rhine Valley, you could find traders from literally everywhere. Roman Gaul and Germany traded continuously. Along the Rhine, the trades kept on into the North Sea up to the very north of Norway. We know of Romans actually crossing very far east even to today's Denmark and Baltic Sea, etc. So this was a world that began to know the Romans and began to actually gravitate around the Roman Empire. This probably had some... we shouldn't stress this excessively, for in the case of the Frankish League, or at least the tribes that made up the Frankish Confederation, previously of the birth of the same confederation, but indeed, also in terms of material culture, this was a pretty important thing. I mean, these tribes knew the Romans, knew what they were about, they knew what their power was, they knew what the risks were in interfering into Roman affairs, and there were also a big deal of friendly relations. So it's not, it wasn't Romans versus Germans. It never really happened like that, historically speaking. And I don't know where I was going with this, but yeah, I was just giving a bit of background. I wanted to say something else, but I forgot. So there were actually some strict relations that immediately were probably understood by the Franks to be profitable for them. Because the let's say the Franks had this first phase into which they realized the potential that being allied with the Romans could lead them to. So this wasn't. We have to think that the Germans weren't really thinking to be part of the Roman Empire. I mean, this would also need to be properly debated, because it's not even so simple as I'm saying this. But before I said that the Germans were not, they didn't have a big deal of cultural resistance. This is true, but at the same time they had a great sense of superiority. I mean, the Germans have never believed to be inferior to the Romans. On the contrary, they thought at best to be equal, and in innerly really to be superior to the Romans. And they never bought the fact that because their ethics, their culture, they were all about war. These societies were, as I was saying before, there was no other way basically but to fight continuously there, because there was no other way to live off of the land. Basically, you needed to raid, you needed to migrate. So necessarily that molded the Germanic culture into a fashion was strictly warlike. Not that the Romans were less warlike, but the Germans were in a tribal way. So they attach a much bigger deal of individualism and individual values to the single male freeman. So the idea that the Romans were pretty much, they weren't so secularized, but they were rationalizing their empire. I mean, they knew that that politics and war passes also through things that have nothing to do with personal courage, or this is how big civilizations work. The Germans instead lived in this heroic minded attitude that also recognized, obviously, it entailed a lot of pragmatism as well. But this for saying that the Germans always felt to have a parity relation with the Romans in some way, never felt to be their subjects. But never, and even these confederations were created for actually for reasons that now we don't have the time to explain proper, but they were at a time fighting against the Romans, at a time actually allying themselves with them, and actually fighting for Rome also against other Germans. This began from the very early times. I mean, basically at all times in Roman history there were Germans that were fighting for Rome and others against Rome. So the this began early. These, especially the Germanic elites, knew what Rome was about. They went in Rome to be raised and educated. Like it was in the case of Hermann Arminius. So we don't have to think of the Germans as an isolated people that once again that at a certain point popped out and invaded the Roman Empire. No, they were perfectly part of the mechanism. It's just their individual, their subjective perspective that was felt as something different from the empire in also in actual quality of arms. The Germans would take great pride during the Middle Ages for the fact of having managed to basically surpass the empire and ruling in the same lands into which the empire had ruled, because they thought that their gods basically had given them those, or even the Christian god, when it got Christianized, they had entrusted them this role, and this was very, very, very felt into among the Franks. So this happened also for reasons that hopefully now we will see. This is something, for instance, that the because there were certain Franks that in this sense collected the Roman legacy and saying, okay, now we are the new Romans. That's what the Franks did. For instance, the Longobards didn't do that. Another very Romanized people were the Goths. The Visigoths in Spain, if they had not been wiped out by the Arabs, they were building something, ideologically speaking, very close to what was the Constantinopolitan model, in the court, in the religious authority. Then obviously the state was really not a big deal. In fact, it was wiped out by the Arabs pretty easily. But let's say that certain, also traditionally speaking, this migration era, there were certain sides, traditional sides. It's like a bit, the Visigoths, the Franks were more pro-Rome. The Ostrogoths, the Longobards were really against Rome. Well, this is also false, because actually the Ostrogoths eventually, well, it depends on the time, the Ostrogoths eventually went to Italy on behalf of the Roman Emperor to govern Italy in his name. So they always were probably a bit traditionally less friendly to the Romans than obviously also the fact that they settling in Italy at that point placed them between the Byzantines and the Franks. So this revived kind of the hostilities against the Romans, bringing to the to the Greek Gothic War that we named before. So there was a bit of this switching. I made a video, for instance, about the Burgundians. The Vandals were another people that were really against Rome, really by standard. The Burgundians, so. The Burgundians were a little bit weak, so from one side they kind of sided with the Huns, then eventually were punished by the Romans, settled into Gaul, and then they become friends with the Romans. So this depended really on many different on the political situation. Obviously, there is nothing about being friend or enemy. It's really contingencies that bring you to behave like that, to be to take a direction rather than another. So even if the Franks had this additional problem that, as we've seen, they didn't have a common guide, because they were so very egalitarian in the way they had formed up their own league. Franks means free. So this, these Germanic confederations had essentially a name that they used internationally speaking, to be called by the foreigners in a certain way. Then within the confederations, the single tribes kept calling themselves in the old ways. We have a few actual evidence of that, but the few ones we have are pretty meaningful under this point of view. So these confederation names were kind of shout-outs to say, okay, I'm certain slogans. I am this guy. Also, the Alemanni had this kind of egalitarian name, like all the men. It literally means the Franks were the free, and they were so free, however, that this is a hard lesson to be learned in history. That when you want to be too free, you also have to pay the backside of it. That is, essentially, you don't have a central government, and you can't do certain things. So sometimes the relation with the Romans was a bit problematic, because maybe a branch of the Franks behaved in a way, or another one behaved in another. By the way, in fact, you see at a time now of Clovis that the two major let's say let's call them tribes. I don't know if it is really correct, but the two major tribes, the Salians and the Ripuarians, Franks, the Sali or Ripuari in Latin, were a bit of a different thing, even culturally speaking. The Salian Franks were actually the ones from the more continental areas. The ones also a bit more of the forests. If you want, also probably, I can say, the more warlike, but those were probably stuck more to tradition. The Ripuarians were a bit one who came a bit more in the external, into the rivers area, but this is not really, we're still pretty homogeneous, as you can understand. But only the fact that they called themselves into a different way still meant that they they felt to be different for some reason, for some tradition. This time traditions had to do with the mythical origins of the tribe, their laws, their customs, even their look sometimes, because into war they had to be recognized also in some fashion. Usually it was the haircut that told you who was who into a battle and all. And this all was a fully magical world. I mean, the idea is that these beliefs were all attached to supernatural creeds and all. So it was something that really tell you these societies were still relatively very primitive in some way, but I don't mean primitive in a negative sense. I really mean the fact that they stuck to a more heroic world that is a sort of a dreamlike atmosphere, which you still believe to be strongly tied to the origins, to the myths, to the gods, etc. Then eventually you modernize, you speed up, you secularize, and you lose those traditions, but you get more powerful. And this is what the Franks eventually do, thanks to Clovis. Excuse me, I drink a little before I go on. So this and this premise is important because we will see that basically the Franks were some of the most egalitarian tribes among the Germanic peoples during the migration era, but they turned out to create the most, let's say, verticized, stratified society of all. So they passed from an extreme to another. Naturally, there were other Germanic populations that were so egalitarian as well, so I don't want to stress it as if, but let's say that among the peoples that eventually got into to rule over the Roman lands, probably the Franks were some of the most they were egalitarian. I use this term as probably. Also the Longobards were a bit like this, but I don't know, it would be interesting to make some comparison. However, you understand that even through the relations with the Romans, the Romanization of the Franks, even for the same fact of being controlled by the Romans, these tribes began to be a bit more verticized. I mean, the Romans needed, when they chose these allies among the barbarians, they tried essentially to appoint a leader among these peoples. So doing something that part of the same population would have not really appreciated, but that was more useful because this made these allies more reliable. One thing is, it's a bit what the Byzantines did with the Longobards too. Before they migrated into Italy, they had kind of appointed, recognized officially a king, let's say. So, and this is very important because for the sake of military needs, you need a chief that is able to mobilize a certain amount of troops. So if instead you have to call every single chieftain to move his bands, that's not going to be very effective, is it? And this made things also easier to control because these Germans were pretty eager to launch raids and all. So by giving them a more stratified order, the local chieftains were a bit more capable, being a bit more powerful. They were also a bit more capable of controlling all the various clans that made up the population and making them refrain from, say, launching a raid into the Roman territory if at the time the people was allied with the Romans, because the Germans really behaved like this. And a big deal of Germanic history at this point is exactly the swinging towards these extremes, because the Germans were so unruly. by vocation. All they heard was, to make the good, to carry out a raid, to make a good booty, and to say, okay, we were so brave and good, and to hope to get more power with the booty when they would have got home. That was their greatest pride, and none of them liked one of the other to prevail. So that's why also they were always clashing one against the other as well, more frequently than what they did themselves with the Romans themselves. But you understand that a situation like this, from a strictly civil point of view, cannot be maintained when eventually you try to be integrated into something a bit more stabilized, a bit more civilized, as a matter of fact. So the Germans were used to that, because we said it before. In Germany, there was no other way to live but behaving like that, because the environmental structures didn't allow you to simply capitalize upon agriculture and all, because it was simply there was no potential for that, economically speaking, technologically speaking. So this is why the Germanic society had been shaped in that way. But these leaders, these Germanic leaders that began to interact more with the Romans, to fight in alliance with them, etc., they kind of began to look more far than that. They began to understand that there was a world out there that was more organized, that had, in this sense, more benefits to offer than just raiding into it, but seizing it would have been a more profitable thing. So the Franks had been pretty much schooled in this sense, because they had actually joined even the clashes that were occurring within the same empire. Gaul was especially this area that saw many revolts from central power, from local Roman commanders. There was an empire of the Gauls at a certain point. These Franks that lived just across the Rhine were so easily employable by the local Romans, especially the ones settled in Trier, because Trier, Augusta Treverorum in Latin, was the center of one of the most important strategical center of the empire. And usually these Gallic usurpers ruled from there, also because along the Rhine, along the frontier that Trier was close to, there were all the legions. So it was also full of military presence in the area. It was a very militarized environment, and the Franks also learned a lot from that. They learned a lot how to fight as well, to be organized, etc. Because there was also this variation into the German. There were certain Germanic tribes that were they absorbed more knowledge from the Romans than others, also in technical skills and all. And this corresponded to the degree of openness to Roman civilization in a sort of sense. Many of these bands, so you don't have to imagine just the leaders, the chieftains, to politically and therefore consequently militarily bonding with the Romans. There were also individual bands of warriors, of Germanic warriors, who simply sold quite freely their service to the Roman army. It was typical at this time of these Germans to join the Roman army as auxiliaries, to fight into the legions, to go out there to receive a pay and all, and then when they were fine and they had survived, they to come back into their native lands. We have pretty much extensive evidence of this. I mean, not so extensive, but also in here the few we have is pretty meaningful. There are, I think there is a tome from Denmark that says this, of a So Denmark was never conquered by the Romans, but the guy that was buried there had on his grave made show that he had been a Roman auxiliary. So you have to think quite easily that were Germans living as far as in Scandinavia, and also non-Germans who came, I don't know, who knows from, I mean, from the Baltic seas, from the depths of Russia, I don't know where they came surely at some point to join the Roman army. You have to think all these populations really, we have this very stupid idea that the Roman Empire had a border. The Roman Empire had no border. There were areas that naturally were more important, so they were guarded more by the Romans, but the concept of the so-called limes, as we call them, telling the truth, did not really exist. The Romans thought that essentially deploying a legion somewhere had a deterrent effect on the world surroundings. So while we think about the Rhine limes, for instance, on the Rhine River, on all the legions that were settling there, we don't really have to think it as, from this side of Gaul there are the Romans, from this other side of Germany there are no Romans. So it's either inside or outside the empire, because the Romans really so that conceive it like the Roman legions were kept along the Rhine to keep at bay both the Germans and the Gauls. So even if the Romans didn't settle permanently into Germany, they still controlled these populations, and it was normal for these populations to enter in contact with them and to interact with Rome. It's this major thing that exists there, the ecumenic empire, the world empire, an extremely rich, advanced, developed place, and you live at the outskirts of it, and you're obviously going to be attracted by that. So if you are a young German warrior that wants to prove his own skill and ability and courage, etc., and you want also to make a bit of money, you go into the Roman army, you join, you fight, you hopefully survive, and then that's a living. For those time standards, this was a very, very good living. And naturally, obviously, these Germanic warriors were already used to any kind of small-scale raiding warfare and stuff like that. So the people were already quite tough, and this was quite normal. That especially these more primitive populations were the ones that the Romans were looking at for military service. It's like a bit with the Illyrians in the 3rd century. By the 3rd century, the majority of the Roman Empire territory had been pretty intensely Romanized. So the Italians didn't want to fight anymore like soldiers, because the military service was a pretty heavy thing. Also the Gauls that had given so many troops to Rome in the early empire, they didn't like military service anymore. So who was engaged? Some of the least Romanized populations of the empire, the Illyrians, the Moors, and peoples that were already pretty used to, that saw military service as something, convenient compared to their lifestyle, whereas the rest of the civilized world kind of tried to escape recruitment, because that was a pretty tough, very, very tough experience, and you were tied forever, especially from the Diocletian reforms. Basically, if you were a soldier, if your father was a soldier, you had to be a soldier as well. So you have also to think this kind of case-like pattern was setting into the Roman Empire. So naturally, these Franks weren't the Franks, just like the other Germans we mentioned, didn't join the Roman army just for purely, just for finding a job. Obviously, it was a lot of political things involved. First of all, because as we've seen, the Romans interfered pretty heavily into the German affairs, and therefore the various German tribes were counting on Rome even to settle their own disputes, to receive help, etc. So this was all a political game. So as a Germanic chieftain, you had to choose. If you were a Frankish German, say, you had to choose at one point what it was, how profitable it was to you to join from the Roman side, to interact with the Romans, to go fighting with them. And the Romans, by the way, were using these auxiliaries pretty hardly. The auxiliaries into the Roman army were the ones who actually bore the greatest part of the fight, the combat. So joining the Roman army at this point wasn't like saying, okay, I'm a privileged chieftain. You could be wiped out, really, and it happened also many times. And Rome was also not very forgetful. If you did something wrong, you could be wiped out by the Romans as well. So sometimes you neither had actually an option. There was probably a lot of blackmailing involved into this as well, and from both sides, because also the Germans could launch raids far into especially into the precious Roman Gaul, etc. But over time, these Germanic leaders began also to make career in the Roman Empire, in the Roman military, as it's known, especially at these later times of the 5th century. Big deal of the Roman commanders at this time is de facto of Germanic origin, as it's known in the West as well, in the East, although naturally in the West, as it's known, the Germans kind of take over. In the East, they're still able to be controlled. There are also very strong anti-German reactions at some point. Another very important part of this is that the Roman army worked as a very effective Romanizer mean of Romanization, we can say. So the many sometimes this decadentistic historiography of the 19th century believes that the Roman Empire failed, so all these army became so barbaric and all. It's so bad. Telling the truth, it's completely false. I mean, as long as there was a Roman state, the Roman army has been always a first-class armed force, and it was especially the model also for these barbarians. By the way, you can understand that also from how the equipment, among the other things, of these Germanic peoples evolved. As I was saying before, in Augustan times, these were primitives of the caves. By the 5th century, you see that they were equipped essentially like the Romans were equipped. So this has a big deal of meaning in terms of what the Romanization had been capable of. But especially relatively to the army, you have to understand that these commanders didn't feel themselves as Germans who, had taken over the Roman Empire. They thought of themselves to be Roman soldiers, and yeah, they were Germans as well. They believed in their gods. They had their own language, but this is the beauty of Romanization, that you could be Roman independently from which language you spoke, from which culture you came from. Didn't matter. There were maybe just some religious problems concerning, the fact that you had to swear allegiance to either the emperor's deity at the beginning when the empire was still pagan. In these later times, the federati were not required to be Christian proper because they were allies. They weren't Roman soldiers proper. But let's say also in there was a lot of syncretism, and at this time the same Germans are Christianizing, especially the ones that are involved into the Roman affairs, also because some of these military leaders could arrive even to marry into the Roman imperial family. So you needed to be Christian. You couldn't be a pagan still. So normally, as we've said many times in our videos, these Germans were mostly Arians. They weren't Catholic. This was an important political stand, saying, we are Christian, okay, we kind of accepted the Roman deity, but we believe in it in a different fashion. So Arianism was a bit of a symbol of Germanism in part. Also because these populations, by the way, they could be Aryan formally by name, especially the elites got Aryanized and therefore Christianized in this sense, but they largely kept believing into their own gods for a certain time. Even Clovis, that we are seeing today, was he converted famously, but that was a political move. Do you think that Clovis on his deathbed, he actually probably believed in both, because from a the monotheistic beliefs are exclusive because they conceive there is only one God. For a pagan, this doesn't exist. As a pagan, it's normal for you to integrate other gods into your pantheon as a regular basis. So it's perfectly possible that Clovis believed in both. The Christian god and the Germanic ones was perfectly fine. Also because in his mind of a 5th century born German, he surely believed that the Christian god also was something similar to the pagan ones. That it was enough to pray to him to actually obtain victory, and this is what he's allegedly done. In fact, when he decided to get converted, he decided this during a battle. A battle against the Alemanni was going wrong. It was, I think, the great victory of Tolbiac against the Alemanni, and during the midst, the Franks were losing, and Clovis, that evidently up to that point had prayed to the pagan gods, he called for help to the Christian god, and he promised him that if he had won, he would have won. He had won. He would have got converted to Christianism. And from Clovis' conversion, eventually, allegedly, all the Frankish nobility converted to Christianity. So that was a political stand that we'll try to explain today. Naturally, because now at this point the Germans they had to necessarily to be integrated into Gaul, that was largely Christian. The Germans couldn't rule without the Roman elites into Gaul, because the Roman elites were extremely powerful in there. So Christianization was the most intelligent thing to do. And by the way, this is important, the Franks didn't actually pass through Arianism. I mean, most of them. Then, of course, individually speaking, there have been Arian Franks at some point as well, but they converted straight from paganism to Catholicism. And this was very, very, very important also to stress how close they were to the Romans at that time. So they didn't make like the Goths that first converted to Arianism and then it took some time. No, they decided to get Catholic immediately, like the Romans, and that is also very, very meaningful. So, as you know, the main change into, the Franks at this time were settled into, still partly, at the beginning of the 5th century, let's start from here. They were settled greatly still in part in Germany, so beyond the Rhine, actually. And just a part of them had settled into areas along the Rhine, etc., because the Romans had let them do like that. And actually, the Romans had placed them there to stem the advance of other Germanic populations. So the Franks at this time were acting a bit like a bulwark against the Eastern Germans. The Alemanni had done something like that. The Alemanni were, I made a video that is getting lots of views about the Alemanni, history of a Germanic people. It's a bit of the story of the Alemanni. In there I explain how this population was a bit more against Rome, ideally speaking. But at this time they were also federati as well, of the Romans, because they settled into this area of today's roughly southwestern Germany, the Agri Decumates, that had been actually the only land in Germany that the Romans had managed to settle into maintain. Also in there for the environmental reasons. You say that wherever grape can be cultivated, the Romans settled. And in fact, still today, southwestern Germany is the only place where the grapes are cultivated. It's one of the warmest, actually the warmest area of Germany. But the Alemanni were completely, they had a very different mindset. First of all, neighbors do not really like each other. So the Franks and the Alemanni were bordering, and the Franks were a bit more pro-Rome, the Alemanni were a bit more against Rome, historically speaking. In fact, the Alemanni seemingly didn't even convert to Christianism for a very long time. They didn't even need in here to pass through Arianism in part. I mean, some of them obviously were Arian, but the Alemanni remained largely pagan for a very long time. In fact, this is actually cool because, differently from other populations like the Franks and the Longobards that kind of Christianized early, the Alemanni still buried their dead with lots of goods on. So in which the other Christianized Germans stopped to do. So that's great for archaeological finds because sometimes we'll literally stop knowing even how these troops were equipped once the people got Christianized, because they didn't bury their weaponry anymore. But whatever. So among this Rhine frontier, the Franks had kind of substituted partly the Roman legions. Now, at this time, the whole thing was in uprest. The Huns were about to arrive, and in fact, in 406, the great breakthrough of the Danubian Germans occurs into Gaul, because these populations are fleeing from the Huns, and they push so much on the Rhine border, and they manage to pass. And the Franks on this occasion actually had fought pretty hard together with the Romans to halt this invasion. So the Franks actually took that pretty seriously, also because if these peoples now were pouring in, they would have taken certain spaces that obviously the Franks even were already looking at for them to acquire themselves. But they were still very faithful to the Romans. The Romans trusted the Franks. So as I've said before, it was not a matter of friendship. I'm sure that there were friends at times between some Roman soldiers, some Frankish soldier, but at a broader political level, etc. These were friends for convenience, obviously not. And the Franks were naturally always exploiting also every favorable situation that could aggrandize themselves, and they weren't so keen on the Romans either. They minded their own business, but up to that point, staying into the Roman orbit had paid them pretty well. So the year 406 is this great cataclysm into the political equilibrium of the West, of the, let's say, the strategical equilibrium of the West. Because these peoples of the Vandals, the Alani, these Swabians, etc., all make their way through into Gaul, and for some time, these peoples didn't even really know where to settle. So there was a pretty messy situation, and at this point the Franks realized that the Roman authority over the Gauls, because often we say Gaul at singular, but actually there were several different Gauls at this time, and even from a geographical point of view it does make a sense, as we were saying at the beginning of the video, where the Romans were losing control, and the Franks were settled, as we've said, into the north of Gaul, parts of that in the northwest of Germany, and they realized that the Roman authority has evaporated. At this time, even in 410, as probably the Romans had abandoned Britain, and not even because they had been pushed away. It's simply because they didn't consider Britain to be so important anymore to keep, while those, especially they needed troops to fight on other fronts, so they leave Britain on its own. Actually, with a Romano-Britannic administration that kind of worked also probably better than we think, and that's where the Anglo-Saxons begin to pour in consistently. So it's a whole area of Europe that is basically abandoned by the Romans. The Romans obviously never gave up the idea of reconquering those lands, but they were forced by reality to not to do that, because they didn't have resources at any time at this point to accomplish that. Say up to the 60s of the 5th century, the Romans could reconquer easily southern Gaul and Spain as well, and even Africa. They could have made it. So, but Gaul at this point was northern Gaul, especially. Was a bit too far, and the Franks find themselves into this area with no one to guard it, and they say, okay, we've been allies of the Romans up to this point, and we actually want to remain allies of the Romans. Also because at this time you have to think that in Germany there were the Huns that were taking over, so the Franks needed someone to help them against the Huns as well. And therefore, however, they decide to migrate proper into Roman Gaul, into this area of the north of Gaul that is comprehended, let's say, north of the Loire river, excluded Armorica, so excluded Bretagne, because that was a very wild area and they didn't care even to settle there. So actually this very this area, very large area that corresponds to the basins of the these large rivers between the Mons, the Seine, very large and fertile basins to settle. So this is how the Francia is actually born, the land of the Franks. Before settling into the Roman world, these Germanic populations didn't have a proper idea of what it meant to be owning a land, in the sense that they've always felt themselves to be on the march in some measure, at least that these lands, they knew that there were better lands out there, and therefore they were always craving for them. As we have said, in Germany it was a completely different situation. These populations were mostly semi-nomadic, at least on at a local level, and they get this idea of territoriality, and I don't know how to say that, just when they in fact install themselves into this fully sedentarized world of the Roman Empire, and start living together with the sedentary population. So this obviously entails a great transformation of and the absorption of the Germanic element into the local society, and that's how the Latin Germanic Europe was created. So we're talking about kingdoms proper that have a defined territorial extension. They need a certain administration to control the territory, and something very, very, very strange for the Germans, the German tradition. To the German tradition, because the Germans had never gone into it. So a great deal of Romanization naturally takes place in the process, and the Franks entered into a territory that, therefore, as we said before, they already partly knew, because they had already been stationed there as when they reached the highest ranks of the military hierarchy. They had shifted men, resources. They knew how the place was, and that's why they migrated into there in the first place, because they know of all the advantages that Roman civilization could give to them. So this Francia was pretty huge, if you think about it. In the southeast, he basically reached the the Franks. As soon as they settled into this area of Francia, they began immediately to expand. This is important to remember, because in the southeast they reach up to the Alemanni on the Middle Rhine. In the southwest, they reach up to the basin of the Seine River. So the there is actually a major entity still into Roman Gaul that has still some power. And it is the so-called, what you find named as the Kingdom of Soissons. Soissons is a city in the northeast of Paris today. I think it's in Picardy, as already geographically speaking. And this was actually a very strong center that had even survived the fall of the West Roman Empire as a Roman organized entity from a political and military point of view. So this was the most important of Gallo-Roman domination, the most important nucleus of Gallo-Roman domination, that worked as an autonomous military center. And it was ruled by Syagrius, in this, that was the local Roman official, deputed. Obviously, as we were saying before, these were all kind of mixed, ethnically mixed commanders. They were already pretty half Germanic, or at least they had some level of Germanization as well. And they and Clovis in 486, so actually 8 years later compared to 8 years later to the fall of the Western Roman Empire, he destroys it. So Clovis makes this very first big move to take away the last bulwark of Roman domination in there. At this point, there is really nothing that. So we skipped actually pretty much of this history. Actually, we skipped all the wars with the Huns. At the Battle of the Catalonian Fields, the Franks were fighting against the Huns alongside with the Romans. The Romans, the Huns fought together with the Ostrogoths, all these populations that were more from the anti-Roman side, that had decided, maybe not even so happily, to side with Attila and to therefore obey him in his policy against the empire. From the Roman side, there were the Visigoths, so these traditionally great allies of Rome, and the Franks. So there had been a very progressive transformation also after the settlement of the Franks into Gaul, that had not implied a break, however, with between Rome and the Franks. Actually, the Franks stuck to Rome, even if they had seized all this big territory. In 486, Clovis knows perfectly well that this time the Western Roman Empire de facto doesn't exist anymore. That the Western Europe, in this sense, it's really out on its own. That the Byzantines are too far to intervene into the northern Gallic matter. So Clovis looks at the kingdom of Syagrius and says, okay, this is a pretty solid center. That it's the last, say, major obstacle for my conquest of the north of Gaul and seizes it and defeats the armed forces of Soissons at this point. And so this was a kind of a necessary thing to do, to attempt at least. Not maybe Clovis might have been defeated as well. So Clovis at this time, it was actually just one of the kings. He was from the Salians. What is interesting about this is it's still the bonds that is this hybrid nature of the Franks. I mean, it's really the idea that these guys were German, but were however still thinking partly to be I mean, they were strongly Romanized, but they still felt this kind of even undecided situation. You know, did they have to fully Romanize and to remain German? Because this was actually, from a political point of view, was a very big concern at the time. And obviously, history was from the side of the Romanization. Clovis, by the way, was son of Childeric, who had been a great ally of Rome. He had fought a lot for the Roman government in Gaul, and Clovis' mother instead was a Thuringian, and she was the Thuringians were into Germany, so they were actually these fully still relatively non-Romanized people living into Germany. And you have to think even into these you know, in being raised by there were different views of what the relation of a proper German with the Roman Empire had to be in some sort, because the Germans, as we've seen, really believed in their values, really believed in the fact that they were completely free, that the Roman models were somehow not the true ones, that there was you know, the old Germanic tradition was better, that I'm telling this all very superficially, but just to make you understand that even the Germans were posed in front of the choice of whether to, you know, remain German in a certain sense or take a further step. Now, for the history of the world, what Clovis did as a choice was actually crucial, because he decided to basically push for the Romanization of the world people. So you have to imagine naturally into this situation where the Western Roman Empire had fallen and there was no center of gravity anymore, that there were lots of adjustments that had to take place necessarily, because up to the moment to which the government of Ravenna had existed, there was still the idea that that was the point of reference for the Germans. The Germans really cared about what Romans did, and they behaved accordingly, and they especially, one thing that is often overlooked is that they were actually quite respectful of the Romans in some measure. Fighting against the Romans doesn't mean to disrespect them, because actually the Germans understood that the Roman Empire had been the world's empire. So they were very mindful, they were very respectful towards the Roman deity, because they thought, you know, what kind of gods, you know, what you know, if these people have conquered the earth, you know, they are great. So we as Germans are greater, they probably believed, but we still have to be cautious, because the god of the Romans is so powerful in offending the Romans, offending the empire, and therefore the god to which the empire is by which the empire is protected, it can be an insult, and something bad can happen to us. They really reasoned in this way. So the Germans greatly admired the Roman Imperium, because the Imperium, and I stress this especially in my video about the Roman eagle, that in which I discussed it, was actually it might seem strange, but the Roman Empire, the Imperium proper, was really felt by the Germans as this proof of of military might. This was a common Indo-European language. The idea that who wins in war is the one who is a virtuous person, and that the deities reward with through the victory itself, with the victory itself. So the Germans were extremely attracted by this, and the most Romanized ones, I mean, some of them obviously despised the Romans, because you have to imagine naturally also a certain degree of pride of these cultures against Rome proper. So there was probably the party that admired the Romans the most, and the others that were more, that despised it more. But the ones who admired the Romans probably admired a bit what we admire us today. So this greatness, this military might, and from their religious point of view, they definitely realized that there was a great honor in continuing in the wake of the Roman rule in itself. So that's why the Germans were so proud of having conquered the regions of the empire, not for having done something wrong to the Romans, but for having taken their empire from them through victory, so through something that was sanctioned divinely, and that now belonged to them. This is why it is so great also in Clovis that the legend according to which he called for the Christian God during the battle, because you realize that obviously he had not understood anything about the Christian God, or maybe he had. No, I don't want to say this, because I don't want to underestimate really the deep meanings of actually even the same Christian religion, that it has to do a lot with war proper, as a struggle, as a I don't want to say this, but let's say that the fact of having called the Roman God at that point, from a completely pagan point of view, so not an Arian here that was already Christian, but from a pagan like Clovis, equated to say, if you give me victory, I will side to you. So that was a bit more than a merely religious stand. It was basically saying, if I win, I will take the same God that the Romans have. Just what it meant in a society that lived, in this sense, across the two worlds, the Germanic and the Roman ones, what it meant even in the choice, to make such a choice, really. I don't know if I explained myself correctly, but I think this is a very subtle and very, very fascinating point to make that is often overlooked. Because it sounds as if, one day, history, the barbarians arrived, conquered Rome, point. No, there were all these cultural problems behind. And they were very, very, very important for them at the time. So if you want to understand their history, we have to understand this. We have to try to understand their perspective. So Clovis was son of these two traditions, literally. From one side, his father, who was a Romanized Frankish chieftain, and his mother that was a Thuringian princess, and therefore coming from the, still the wilderness of Germany, and its true hardcore, free Germanic mindset. And so the point I was making actually was that at this point this great power in the West doesn't exist anymore. Yes, the Roman Empire is still there. Even the Franks at the time knew that the Roman Empire was not the Byzantine Empire, but was the Roman Empire. So please learn this yourself if you haven't yet. But they were clever enough to understand that now that empire was far away. It was on the other corner of Europe. So also this is important, the ideological fact and the pragmatic fact that always interfere with each other. So the big problem now is that all these Germanic peoples settled here and there across Germany, Gaul, Italy, Spain, etc. now were pretty much on their own. And Clovis takes this stand. First of all, seizes Soissons. Secondly, he extended and consolidated the Frankish domination against the Thuringians, because these, we have seen there were all these kind of marriages, the pretty multi-ethnical between in this case the Franks, the Thuringians, etc. But the whole situation were very, very unstable. So these guys would go at war against each other pretty often, as much as they could form a bond and an alliance and stuff like that. So the Thuringians were these. They were in the eastern part of the. To the east of the Franks, into Germany, and by the way, the Thuringians will get basically destroyed in this sense, because the Thuringians were one of the few peoples that were actually. Yeah, Thuringia actually remained as a population, etc. But let's say that the Franks and the Saxons shared a bit their cake, so that the Thuringians kind of lost of their autonomous political importance. It was one of the few times to which the Franks and the Saxons interacted, and I can tell you that they immediately started to clash. Well, actually, most intensely from the 7th century, so a bit later, but immediately, there wasn't such a huge friendship. Although they were pretty similar, especially in Austrasia, that is the eastern side of Francia, eastern part of, let's say, because I didn't say this, but Francia was divided in two, famously, Neustria and Austrasia. So the Neustria was the Gallic part, let's say. Well, also Austrasia comprehended part of the old Gaul, but let's say it's as if a bit, was more Neustria, a bit more the Romance part, the French part, and the Austrasia a bit more of it Germanized, the Netherlands and etc. And the Franks of Austrasia were actually pretty similar to the Saxons that were bordering into the east, but however, and in fact the Carolingians emerged from there. And it was also the most turbulent area of the empire. It was the most Germanized, the one that stuck still to the most primitive environment, and that therefore had a higher degree of militarization. It's not surprisingly that the Carolingians actually emerged from there as very good, effective military leaders. Then this is important. The defeat of the Thuringians is important because it expands Frankish settlement and domination in the Germanic forests in the basins between the Weser and the Elbe River. This is important for Germany because from this channel the Franks managed to import a freaking lot of of Western, let's say Roman models into parts of Germany. So that part of even the reclamation, the deforestation into Germany begins obviously very timidly, but still in part effectively to happen already during the Merovingian times through this channel. And therefore Thuringia has this bit more of an influence. And in fact, the area around there will also, towards the Rhine, will be called Franconia, because it basically bore the name of the Franks as this, not just the original Frankish people, but also this broader Frankish kingdom that Clovis had created. And by the way, these areas are still pretty tormented. By the end of the 6th century, the Avars begin to launch raids into Germany, and they arrive up to, I don't remember where, but I mean up to the Rhine, if I'm not wrong. So these are areas that are pretty, that the Franks were also putting a lot of care in. You don't have to consider the Franks as, at this time, as a merely Western thing, as a merely French thing. At this time there was no division. There were this kind of hybrid of they were Germanic, Roman and Gallic in some measure. So still the modern nationalities didn't exist as we know them. So the Franks took great care also these, let's say, German lands. famously, the Clovis defeated the Alemanni as well, and this is what also triggered his. I don't remember if it was the Battle of Tolbiac when Clovis actually decided to call up for the Christian God. Well, I am not searching it now, but you can search it for yourself. So I don't want to give you wrong informations. So go check it out, because it came in my mind to my mind now that this is a doubt I have, because I never get it right. But it should be. I'm not sure, but it should be. But however, the Battle of Tolbiac was the major defeat of the Alemanni at the hands of the Franks. So this allows the Franks, therefore, to expand also into the High and Middle Rhine. Towards roughly, partly, it's more towards the east than else, but also partly towards the north, because the Alemanni also controlled certain territories up north. Now, I don't have really in mind the latitude, but it should be also partly north from the Frankish perspective. And so the Franks at this point control a pretty large area into this, essentially from the Atlantic side. But they begin to intervene also into the Burgundian affairs. I made a video of the Burgundians. Burgundians, the Highlanders of the migration era, because that's the meaning of Burgundian. So I get a bit more into detail about relatively to this in there, if you're interested. So they intervene into the Burgundian affairs. Clovis really does it. The Burgundians, as we were saying before, weren't this hugely powerful entity, but they were well settled at this time into a pretty mountainous territory, into the Rhone Valley and the surroundings. So southern France, northern Italy, southwestern Germany, Switzerland, sorry. And they were not really, at this time, even such a powerful people like the Franks were rising to be right now. They didn't have the manpower, the resources to literally wipe out these populations from a place. So the whole thing worked diplomatically in part. As long as the hostilities ceased, there was some kind of agreement necessarily to be taken to control those lands. So other marriages or other deals, etc. And the Burgundians were defeated by the Franks finally into the 6th century. After having suffered another defeat before, and the Franks at this point are the major power into Gaul, so the Burgundians had to kind of to bow to the Franks in part, and that's also what triggered probably some resentment, and once again they took arms, but just to be defeated finally. So what happens is then the Burgundians had been federati of the Roman Empire as well. So you see here now that dichotomy doesn't really work anymore. At this point, it's really the race for seizing more territories as possible, exploiting this absence of the empire. Also, very importantly, Clovis took away from the Visigoths the largest part of Aquitaine. And the Visigoths are able to maintain just a stripe of land into the south. I don't remember whether Clovis was able to seize parts of Aquitaine, a great part of Aquitaine, except Vasconia and other lands in the northeast of Toulouse that would have been conquered by the Merovingians later. The Visigoths maintained just this area of so-called Septimania, because that took 7 days to seemingly to go across it, so it took this name. So it would be part of the ancient Roman Narbonensis, with Narbonne, those cities there. So that had been actually another major opposer of Frankish domination into Gaul. This time it was very meaningful also from an international point of view, because now the Franks on the distance were creating a sort of Frankish-Byzantine axis that was opposed to the Gothic one, because the Goths had settled into Italy and were already into Spain. So at this point, it was like Italy and Spain versus Gaul and the Byzantine Empire a little bit. Also because, the Franks already at this point were, they were expanding pretty much. Eventually, they really didn't make to do much more at this point. Also because it was a huge domain to control, and eventually the result of the decline of the 6th century, the plague, and also you realize that after Clovis, very slowly these Frankish domination begins to weaken, and also plus the Franks always divided their territory among the male sons. So basically all these internecine wars between the various Frankish princes occur, and the whole thing will crumble. It will take some time, but say by the end of the 7th century, the Merovingian Empire didn't practically exist anymore. Yeah, there were the Franks. There was still this idea of how Gaul had been organized by the Merovingians. We're still the dynasty of the Merovingians before the Carolingians, and even during the Carolingians, the moment Carolingians rose to power, but it had no political or military consistency before the Carolingian reorganization of the empire. So Clovis chose Paris at this point as his favorite residence, and he began the unique chieftain of the Franks. Now this occurred actually through a very bloody policy that he carried out, because you may wonder, how did this guy begin the first among the Franks if the Franks, as you have said, were so egalitarian? Well, quite simply, he literally took all the other Frankish chieftains out. Clovis made an extremely fierce physical elimination of all the Frankish nobility to take the whole Frankish domination in his hands in a very cunning way. He sent assassins, he slaughtered others. I mean, it was extremely cold-blooded. Once he even had an alibi. He once he went into he was accused of having made certain chieftains killed, and he said, "Oh, but at that time I was making a cruise on the I think it was either the Rhine or the Scheldt River." I mean, literally, I'm not joking. So he was very cunning, very subtle, and he managed pretty effectively to take out all of his rivals. And this equated basically to create a true monarchy. What the Merovingians, Clovis belonged to this Merovingian dynasty, this mythical Meroveus, that seemingly was one of his ancestors. He seemingly never existed. It's more of a mythical figure than a legendary character than else. But what a big deal of how Clovis reached to power was that he made everything possible to centralize his power, and the Frankish power in his own hands and the one of his family. This is crucial, and this was what, by the way, now it's very complicated and the video is very, very long. well, okay. The Well, yeah, let's stop it here. Just I'm concluding now. The To concentrate everything possible, ideological, material, everything in his hands and one of his family. A great problem in the Germanic world was this traditional egalitarianism. So the Germanic tribes, as we've seen, were pretty primitive societies. They were not very stratified. This meant that the freemen owned a big deal of power, and they didn't want the aristocracies basically to form up. This is very ideal as a picture, as also in the Germanic world it was the aristocracies that were governing. But these aristocracies tended not to create something greater. Now, during the migration era, for many reasons, chiefly the fact that during the migration you need necessarily a military leader. So someone that guides at least the people. And secondly, the following sedentarization into territories like the one of Gaul, in the case of the Franks, that were extremely wealthy, so where the aristocracies would have immediately seized all the power and enormously increased their status within the rest of the Frankish population, brought certain kings to appear. So these kings naturally were quite ambitious because they had power, they were able, but they still had to struggle to be recognized by the whole people, because these people might have not wanted a monarch in this sense, because the tradition was that every Germanic freeman is equal to another. So what these kings did to aggrandize themselves and their dynasty was to create, in fact, the concept of a dynasty that in this sense was pushed mostly through a sort of ideological way, chiefly a religious one, usually. I mean, claiming that, you came from somewhere, from a god. It's in fact the same Merovingian dynasty. I think it was meant to descend from a sea monster, as a matter of fact. So there was also this totemism involved, and the idea, also the connection with water that comes back also into the Longobird myth, etc. So dynasties who had tried to claim their superior status over the rest of, and their sacred nature, as a matter of fact, and religious power over the population. In some peoples this succeeded, in others it didn't. And the Franks are actually the case into which instead this had more of a success. And in the case of Clovis, in their case, this was achieved by Clovis also naturally thanks to the Gallic resources, because by wiping out the other aristocracies, he managed basically to seize all the Gallic lands for himself. So a great characteristics that the Merovingian dynasty had and kept even through was inherited also by the Carolingians, was the idea that the whole territory didn't belong to the Frankish people. It belonged to the Merovingian dynasty. Now this is extremely important because in other parts of the, this is the most the greatest push towards that direction that any Germanic people actually has done historically, because all the others more or less refused that. If you take the Saxons, I mean, all those who remained in Germany essentially, where the environment remained the same, and therefore great monarchies could not be created simply for the lack of resources. They stuck to these egalitarian models, etc. In England, the Anglo-Saxons remained also a bit like that, because Britain was relatively superficially Romanized, and they created the kingdom more as a coming together of all the various parts. Yeah, I mean, it's approximated here, but that, I mean, it had a much more markedly Germanic political tradition to support it. The Longobards also never recognized the dynasty. The Longobards elected their own kings at every time. It was the Longobard nobility that created this king, and by the way, not as it's usually done when, like in Spain, into Visigothic Spain, where the king is weak. Actually, the Longobards are probably the only functional example the only example of functional elective monarchy that existed at the time. And because they were completely German, they didn't buy, even if they were into Italy, they never bought into the Roman ideology. They stuck to Germanism. The Goths also, the Gothic dynasty tried. I mean, there was a ruling dynasty of the Goths, but it tried to expand its power. It didn't make it. The nobility, the Germanic, say, the Ibero-Germanic aristocracies didn't allow that to do so, and with the excuse, in fact, of the ancient tribal election, basically put this, obliged the Visigothic kings to be always, to have a sort of limited power. And that's why, by the way, the Visigothic kingdom grew to be so weak in some ways. The Franks were the only ones who, first of all, converted directly to Catholicism, because also in the other, both the Longobards and Goths had been Arians before passing to Catholicism. The Franks immediately get straight to Catholicism. So this is the very straightforward attitude of Clovis. Clovis saw it all right. Yeah, he understood that if he wanted to rule over Gaul unopposed, he had to convert to Catholicism, and not to create this attrition that could happen if, the Germanic king was Arian and the rest of the the local, especially the very powerful Gallic dioceses and their senatorial and the senatorial families were Catholic. He made everything to be recognized by the West as ruling over Gaul on behalf of the empire. In fact, he received the vicariate of the Gauls from the Roman emperor. He received a mantle and an insignia for that from Constantinople. He also had, relatively to his conversion, he also had himself baptized in all the proper ways. He engaged very much the bishops in his rule. There was a big deal of things he actually accomplished in this sense. So he set a direction. He had no hesitations. He understood that the Frankish society had to evolve in this way. So this is all the more meaningful because it was against the Germanic tradition in this way, over which he passed in practice. And then he also began to take partly these sedentary models. The idea of having certain preferred residences. We have seen with Paris. He came from Tournai, actually. He was raised in there. But he understood that certain places were more important than others. He organized he also sent he created a new nobility in parts. His faithful counts that were substituted were even sent to rule into all these various kingdoms that he had subjugated, so into Alemannia, into Burgundy, into Aquitaine, to have these men of trust controlling the situation. Now, this was extremely important from an ideological point of view, because he was putting himself into continuity with the Roman rule, in short, to make long story short. Recognizing the let's say, the legacy of the Roman leadership into Gaul that he took in his hands by converting fully to Catholicism, and also by intervening in the international scenario in favor of the Byzantines, because he was sure that they were too far. And actually, well, the Franks intervened partly also against the Byzantines sometimes. At the end of the Greek Gothic War, there were certain Carolingian counts, but this was after Clovis. But generally speaking, Byzantine Empire from one side, the Gaul from the other, let's say, and the main problem for both was Italy. Whoever was in Italy, first the Ostrogoths and then the Longobards, that in this sense kept this watershed. And the actual clash between the Franks of the Romans takes once again, in fact, a place when the Franks under Charlemagne conquer Longobard Italy, and they basically arrive into southern Italy, and that's where into Istria, etc. So that's where the Franks and the Byzantines begin to border once again, and to be one against the other, and that's how the great enmity between the Holy Roman Empire and the Byzantine Empire, let's say, occurs. Well, at times we're allies too, but and I'm just sticking to the migration era now. So the only great weakness of the Merovingian kingdom, it had been created by Clovis, was the impossibility to extirpate from the Frankish customs the ancient Germanic tradition of splitting the goods of the father in equal parts. Now, since we have said that Clovis regarded the Frankish kingdom as a personal property, this equated to the fact that his sons split the kingdom into essentially other smaller kingdoms, and they began to fight against each other. And this is something that went on at every single generation. So that when we talk about the Merovingian Empire, first of all, it was a Merovingian kingdom, because these other populations that Clovis had subjugated, more or less, they were subjected to the Franks because they had been sensibly weakened. Their elites were kind of Frankicized in part, but they kind of dwell on their own, autonomously speaking. It's just under the Carolingian Empire that they come back once again under one sole Frankish ruler. During the 7th century, the Frankish kingdom was actually 4 split, separated kingdoms on their own, and they're constantly fighting one against the other, and by the way, exhausting their own resources in the process. So the Franks never got this right. The greatest faults of the Franks, even into Carolingian times, is they never renounced, ever, to the idea that the empire had to be a public thing. They always conceived it as a private thing. Actually, the only ones who got a bit more this right were Charlemagne and Louis the Pious, who, being at the apex of the Carolingian Empire, they realized that if they wanted to keep what their family had conquered, they had to create a sort of stable ensemble. I discussed this very much into my Carolingian history playlist, so it's full of informations you can find about this topic that is, to me, the most important one to understand actually the Carolingian Empire. So the private nature of the Carolingian, of the Frankish society, more than strictly the Merovingian and the Carolingians. But at that time the Carolingians were quite different. I mean, they had got partly Romanized, that there was, the church was much more structured in an international, let's say, universalistic perspective, also relatively to the universalistic ambitions of the empire. So that's why Charlemagne and Louis the Pious were much more better working mind than his predecessors and successors, kind of tried to get it a bit right from this strictly civil point of view. Then obviously also Charles Martel and Pepin the Short were great leaders, etc. But talking about the generation of Clovis, first of all, it's all an amazing feat to have been able to transform the Franks from essentially a people that had got out of the forest from relatively a few generations into something really much more into a really a Latin, a Romano-Germanic kingdom, and I would say the Romano-Germanic kingdom pro excellence in some way. This was very important, because if you think at how the reality could have evolved, there might have been many other options, honestly. And what Clovis did was, in this sense, amazing. The Franks might have remained a sort of pretty unstable group without no leader of sorts, etc. And instead, the Merovingian kingdom, even though split down it into those other parts, at least it set the idea that this broader domination existed. That they weren't just a Germanic people; they were actually a kingdom, or better, an empire. So a people that had been chosen in a certain sense by God, by the Christian God, but also by the pagan gods in a measure, because the Franks at this time were also superficially Romanized, and they saw, however, this legitimization of their rule in the area as both as a Christian and a pagan thing. Like, from the Christian side, obviously, as we have seen, Clovis converting and engaging the bishops and treating them very well, etc. And from the other side, having won, also thanks to the Christian God, because that's how it had happened in their mind, but through the rights of through the law of arms. So having conquered these territories that and other peoples that in this sense equated to have received a divine favor, whichever god you wanted to believe in. And this is all the more amazing, because even if as we have seen, the Franks got partly Romanized, you have to think of what Clovis could really be at the time from a psychological point of view, in terms of mindset of beliefs. You know, it's not that he was a fully Romanized Germanic chieftain that now gave for granted things like converting to Catholicism or engaging the bishops into the state affairs and all. He was still very roughly pagan, warlike warrior that conceived, obviously had all these very big, also individualistic eddas. And he was, however, very cunning as well, very without scruples, very straightforward. He had definitely all the characteristics that great leaders have, more or less. Sometimes they are all naturally also very despicable characteristics from a moral point of view, but we look at history also through the greatness of such figures, and Clovis killed definitely lots of people, but achieved something extremely great. Maybe today we don't celebrate that much the Merovingian Empire, because we might say, yeah, well, it wasn't this excessive thing, etc., but it's excessive power and all, but you have to think it for the relative standards of the time. I don't know if you get what I'm saying. It's really the effort that this individual made to create this that is extraordinary for the potential of the time. And fighting, again, in this sense, against the traditions of his own people and maybe his own beliefs. Because don't you think that Clovis, in the backside of his mind, when he was getting baptized, wasn't fearful that his ancient Germanic gods that his mother venerated and that would have been disappointed at his behavior and might have caused negative things for him? sometimes these choices are taken. It takes great personalities to achieve, to make some choices, and they're very costly choices as well. So Clovis, in this sense, is a bit of a watershed. It's something that he's a man that abandoned part of his former world, and because he was capable of looking through, of looking ahead, and this is a great quality in a leader. Very few people are capable of doing this, of managing to look beyond their own cultural boundaries and to look at reality straight for what has to be done and what is going to be effective in the future. And this is very, very important, and I don't know a big deal much about telling you about the figure of Clovis. Also, you can imagine it's not that we know this excessive much, but I wish, let's say, I knew more about the Frankish society, etc. Because also in here, I've been talking for more than 2 hours, but I really didn't tell it all, and I didn't naturally. I also didn't tell it entirely right, because obviously I make mistakes all the time. But it's still very important to understand such processes, in my opinion, and to look beyond certain events, certain realities, and even our own world, and trying, when studying history, to really think of not at just the sheer fact that you find listed in here, but try to think what it could really be for the people of those times. Try to imagine, even if we can't, unfortunately, but let's try at least to imagine what it was for those people. What did these people believe? Today, I skipped, by the way, lots of things. I wish I had sent the story of the base of Soissons to. Maybe I can. The fact that when Clovis conquered Soissons, they collected this very large booty in the area, and they collected it. The Franks collected it in one place. Now, it was customary by the Germans to make this loot, and then basically the king but not even the king in here, because the story suggests also something different, and basically to distribute this loot among the various warriors. This was a typical Germanic custom, around which, in fact, this political game was really played, because normally the idea is that every warrior seizes what he has basically pillaged on his own. Already the fact that there is a leader over the other warriors is something that some Frankish nobles didn't like there. So it had happened that by pillaging Soissons, so taking the kingdom of Syagrius and etc., part of the Franks had pillaged part of the local diocese. So the bishop of Soissons went to Clovis and he asked him, look, I've been stolen these precious vase. I don't remember whether it was in gold or in silver, and I would like to have it back. Now this episode is very important because it tells you basically that the bishop was looking already at Clovis not as this barbarous conqueror, etc., but he was speaking with someone who already knew what the deal was into the Roman world. And Clovis, that probably despised the bishop, because as you understand, I was saying before, he was a Germanic warrior. He was still pagan. He had a completely different ethos, but he was a smart person. And he understood and said, okay, I have to treat well this bishop, because if I want to control these territories, I need people like him, who are educated, who knows the community, who administrate lots of things, and these are precious men and revered men among this population of Gaul. So Clovis said to the bishop something, and now I'm paraphrasing, and I don't even remember if I'm getting it all right, but he basically promised to the bishop that he would have taken care of this vase, and if he had found it in the loot, he would have given it to him. So even leaving the benefit of the doubt, because obviously that implied, as we will see now, a clash with the aristocracy. So basically, when all the Frankish say warriors, but better noblemen, because this is what they were. They came to the loot, and the share had to take place. Clovis warned these men and told them, look, I know that this booty is yours, because you have earned it. You have fought, you have bled against Cyrus, and now, yeah, this is yours by right. But if any one of you finds this vase that the bishop has asked me for, please give it to me. So he was even magnanimous. I mean, obviously this is the story of, told naturally also to praise. I think this was Gregory of Tours, if I'm not wrong. So Clovis shows us as a kind of a. By the way, this was the Bishop of Rheims, Saint Remigius. So the one that eventually had that would baptize Clovis. So there is all, you can imagine how the whole thing was framed. So because obviously this vase was sacred, it belonged to the holy vessels, so it was something very important. So what happened is that when Clovis requested his Frankish warriors to give them this vase to him, one of these warriors found the vase and smashed it with his axe. And Clovis, now that was, if you did something like that, you meant that Clovis were your enemy to the death, and you might be known that you would have died soon. So actually Clovis seems to have been particularly nice and to Remigius, and he gave back actually the broken vase, because he understood still the importance of that this vase had for the church. So even if it was in pieces, it's still he was still showing to the bishop that this is yours, and I'm sorry, let's say. Now 1 year later, so it took 1 year. So things you have to think of the ancient Germanic warriors as mobsters, like this is like mafia movies. These guys didn't forget. A year later, Clovis saw the soldier again. Took the soldier's axe and threw it to the ground. And what he does, so doing something extremely insulting, because a freeman is not going to be touch his weapons that are the symbols of his own manhood, of virility, of military prowess, by someone else. With in this Germanic world, that there is no one that can do that. Not even a king, let's say, not even this great military leader. So while the men bent to pick down his axe again, Clovis took his own axe and smashed the guy's head, and commenting over his corpse, just as you did to the vase at Soissons. So it is a beautiful piece of story that naturally is being this is written by Gregory of Tours, definitely, that tells you what Clovis was right at doing here. He was essentially saying, well, I have a very vulgar way to express this, but I think you understand it anyway. That you don't mess up with me, okay? So I'm the leader, and I don't care whoever you are. And this is a very great stand to take, because it means in front of the wall other warriors, by the way, that are the bulk of your armored forces that can even revolt, that you are the guy in charge, and that they have to follow you. Why? Because the deity is from his side. This is the typical Indo-European thinking here. And this goes on, it pours on with the Christian God as well. So that when Clovis converts, all the other Franks could have said, we don't want to be Christians, and instead they obey. because they know that what the leader does has to be done as well. So this is the mindset of the Germanic warrior, and that's how, partly, now that I think about it, also a sort of plus, because it, in this sense, it allowed a sort of collective move, I mean, to move as one, essentially, as a community, which the Germanic peoples during the migration era had to learn to do the hard way. There was a great deal of centralization of these Germanic peoples during the migration era, because if you don't get centralized in time of troubles, you're gonna be wiped out. A single tribesman, a single clansman, you can't do anything. You need a king. You need a and all the more when you settle into a country like Gaul. So Clovis does this extremely also violent, as we have said, carries out this extremely violent enterprise, but manages to change the history of Gaul, of Europe, and of the world forever. So for now, I really stop, and I hope that you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like, or subscribe to my channel if you are interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.